You are listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm your host, Haley Radke, and this is a special episode in our healing series where I interview therapists who are also adoptees themselves so they know from personal experience what it feels like to be an adoptee. Today we tackle coming out of the fog. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome back to Adoptees On, Leslie Johnson. Leslie is a fellow adoptee and licensed therapist who works to help other adoptees connect the dots of their story and live authentically. Welcome, Leslie.
Thanks, Haley. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for coming back on. And now we have met in real life.
I know. That was fun. That was a lot of fun.
It was so fun to give you a hug and see your face in person.
At the Cub conference, Concerned United Birth Parents. It was nice to see some people that I had only known up until then online.
Yeah, so many connections with online friends in real life is so fun.
Yeah.
Well, I asked you back to talk about something I probably say every episode. And sometimes people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. That terminology is unfamiliar, and it is coming out of the fog. And I was wondering, can you help define that for us and just talk a little bit about what that means to you?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So the term coming out of the fog has become really popular in the adoption community. And I guess my definition, I think it's that acknowledgement and, for the first time, really acknowledging and facing the reality of what happened. So for the adoptee and the first parent, birth parent, really facing the grief and loss of the separation. Again, there's no linear time frame when it happens. Maybe for some people it never happens, but it's been my experience, both personally and professionally, that when it happens, things really start to shift. And again, if we're thinking about facing that and trying to integrate the grief and the loss, we're kind of looking at even the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Again, no linear way of processing, but that the adoptee is admitting, wow, adoption really does have an impact on my life. First parent has this acknowledgement of, wow, placing a child really does have an impact on my life. Adoptees, I think we see this on some of the forums and on some of the social media groups, adoptees and adoptive parents too, who get really angry at some of the adoptees who are expressing grief and loss, and kind of they've come out like adoptees and adoptive parents that are angry at adoptees who are coming out of the fog, and you get that pushback of, but I had great parents, and it's not I had great, I was adopted and I had great parents. It's not an either or, it's a both and. There's still the grief and loss.
So what are some of the ways you have seen people experience this? And you said, there's stages of grief and, there's all these different things. It's not linear. Can you explain maybe what that could feel like for someone to go through that process, and maybe what would start them even thinking about it?
An adoptee going to search, beginning their search and recognizing and realizing that their birth certificate is a fake. It's a second birth certificate that was given to them that has their adoptive parents' names on it. And coming out of the fog a little bit further, they aren't allowed to access their original birth document. That can be, a moment where an adoptee realizes, wow, this is going to be difficult, or I have a lot of anger about this. For first parents, I've heard from people in my practice that I've worked with that when their child is about 12 or 13 or 14 in their teen years, that their coming out of the fog looks like grief. Their child isn't a baby anymore, and kind of that solidifies they're not going to parent that child. I think another example related to feelings that an adoptee might have who's coming out of the fog is maybe when they actually meet their biological parents. They meet their first mother and realize she wasn't the poor girl with tattered clothes that perhaps was the narrative shared by the adoptive parents, or she wasn't X, Y, or Z, the narrative shared by the adoptive parents. I think part of when I came out of the fog personally was when I realized I had, and I have no idea where I was for the first 3.5 months of my life, because the story that I was told was that my adoptive parents thought that I was with my biological mother. And then when I met my biological mother, she let me know that she had relinquished me at birth. So that was kind of startling to me because it was also around the time when some really close friends of mine had a little baby, and I was like, oh my gosh, watching her from birth to 3.5 months and kind of was just very kind of jarring for me.
And I think for me, it was a longer process. Some of it was after my birth mother rejected me a little bit. And then when I first met my biological dad and his wife and my siblings, and seeing the losses there, connections with them. And then
Yeah,
really when I got pregnant, my first son, like that was like, that's it. Now I
right.
really know.
Right. And I think so many people, so many adoptees share that when they have children of their own, when they have biological children of their own, that reality of whoa, just whoa. Not only seeing someone that maybe looks like them, but just the experience of I was this infant once, and how did this happen?
Hmm. Exactly. I remember having that thought,
Yeah.
when he was first born, like, how could anyone give away a baby? And
Yeah.
that was the thought I had in my head. But I mean, I understand all the circumstances and all of
Of
those
course. Of
things.
course.
It's just one of those triggers, right? Now, so we've talked a little bit about the adoptees and first parents. Now, what about adoptive parents? Would they experience ever being out of the fog?
I haven't read a lot of this particular piece of the community, adoptive parents coming out of the fog, but I would say absolutely. So I think that would look like when adoptive parents realize that adopting a child isn't the same as having a biological child. It's one way to form a family, but it's not the same. Or when their beliefs shift to recognizing that adopting a child from another country is not saving that child, or that adopting a transracial child. You hear sometimes parents say, "Oh, our family's colorblind," or I think coming out of the fog is acknowledging the responsibility of parenting a child, from another country or another ethnicity. So I think it does apply to adoptive parents too.
Are there any things that we can do when we're going through this experience? I guess what I'm wondering about is I've heard from several people that this coming out of the fog has been excruciatingly painful. It's like a midlife crisis for them, and they feel like their world is upside down. Many of the things you were describing with grief, right? Our experience of deep
Yeah,
grief.
yeah,
What are some things that we can do to move through this process so we don't feel like that, like
yeah. No, of
completely
course.
confused?
I mean, I think you hit kind of the nail on the head too, is that it's a process. So I think the maybe initial coming out of the fog is, maybe it's an event, and then is the person completely out of the fog? I mean, I know you and I have talked, and it's like, can we go back in the fog? Can we, spend a little more time there, because this isn't really fun. But I think it's the same. I think healing and integrating the parts of one's story, especially when it's hard and painful, requires, a lot of self-compassion, therapy, community. I guess what I've seen on, with your podcast and some of the other online groups that I follow, the sense of community and support. You're not alone. Oh, wow, this happened to me, and when I came out of the fog, this happened. This shared collective experience sometimes is really healing and validating. But I think it's also just it's a lot of self-compassion and recognizing this is a process and allowing, yourself to kind of go through the different stages. And I do really think that I liken it to the stages of grief.
I was wondering about we were joking that sometimes we talk about going back in the fog. I
Yeah.
mean, I think just a couple days ago in the Facebook group, we were joking about that again. Uh,
Yeah.
and you and I have talked about this before. Like, why do some adoptees just never come out of the fog? Like, why are there so many happy adoptees that don't even acknowledge a loss? And I remember you saying there's some things like denial and those types of defense
Coping
mechanisms.
mechanisms.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
can be really, healthy and helpful.
Sure.
So I don't want to drag anyone out of the fog, but
No.
can you comment on that a little bit about just living in the fog? Like, I don't want it to be this.
Club that everyone has to join.
Yes. And, we talk about the online groups, and sometimes there's like an us and them, and it's like you're an angry adoptee and you're a happy adoptee. And anyway, can you just comment on that a little bit?
And I know I know what you're referring to too, is that like all, I think, social media groups, like, someone feeling like they have to defend their position. And so if an adopted person was raised in a family where it wasn't okay to talk about adoption, and it wasn't talked about, they become conditioned to think it's not significant. And if there's nothing that challenges that significance, or challenges that belief that this isn't who I am, sometimes you'll hear somebody say, "Well, adoption doesn't define me." I mean, I used to say that, and but it does. I mean, it can't really take the adoption out of me. But I think sometimes if adoptees are raised in an environment where just it absolutely is not talked about, or even worse, that there's almost a spoken or unspoken threat that you're going to harm your adoptive parents if you talk about it, that it just becomes easier to stay kind of in the fog. And nobody's really saying that the fog is a bad place to be, but I guess this is my profession, and I think the truth is your friend, whatever the truth is, and that's going to really set you free. So the fog wasn't a great place for me to be in, but I know for my brother, I think he likes the fog. My adoptive mom loved the fog. She, like I think I've joked with you, is that she's the only person who didn't know I was adopted. So her fog was thick.
When you're describing your brother and your mother like that, and there's just somehow there is this negative connotation to this terminology, and I don't know, I wish it didn't have that, because it's such a nice place to be in. But yes, I do want to live in the truth and see things clearly for exactly what they are.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know what I'm trying to get at, Leslie, but
well, and I think some people do want to see the truth, and some people don't, or choose not to, or don't think they can handle it. Don't think that they have the resources or the strength or the fortitude to go there. So that may also keep people from the kind of exploration of themselves, really. That's really what coming out of the fog is. It's not really about, I mean, it is and it isn't, but it's really about exploration of self. How did this impact me? How does it impact the people, around me? But from, it is really, I think it's connecting the dots of our stories.
Absolutely. And I think maybe this is where this negative connotation comes in, because for some of us, we say out of the fog means waking up to adoption is the worst. But that's not the case. It's waking up to the whole reality of adoption, and that
Absolutely.
I had a loss, and also I had a good or bad experience with my adoptive parents, and my loss doesn't take away or, from my relationship with them. so that whole having the whole picture.
I mean, I think that's absolutely spot on correct. And what if the term was more, not coming out of the fog, but coming into the truth, because that's kind of what it is, right?
Yeah.
Taking away the veils and seeing the truth.
Well, that's pretty good. That's kind of maybe that's like your book title.
All right. I don't know. I guess I just thought of that as I'm just kind of looking at some notes on my desk and, you know, there is I think that there is kind of a negative kind of connotation of coming out of the fog and, um, that, maybe it just speaking about the truth and entering the truth could be a different way of looking at it.
Hmm.
So that's really what we're talking about.
Mhm. If I am out of the fog and I'm seeing these true things,
Yeah.
I'm seeing the full picture for myself, and I'm starting to express some of these feelings and thoughts to my loved ones, and they're not really understanding it. Are there ways in which I could discuss these things, for example, with my adoptive parents who I would say are probably mostly in the fog?
Right.
And are there ways I can engage with them and talk to them about this in a really gentle manner? Again, I don't want to be the one that drags someone out of the fog.
Right. Well, I think we've even talked about this in a previous episode is like, how do we talk about this, adoption, and especially adoption trauma and separation trauma? How do we talk about our experience integrating that with the people that we love and care about? And often that just feels arduous, like, oh, I have to, do I have to do this? Like, but I think there are ways. I mean, and I always reference back to this podcast. I think this podcast is opening so many people's eyes to the experience of adoption. And I don't just mean for the adoptee. I mean for first parents. I mean for adoptive parents, prospective adoptive parents. So, referencing legitimate, sources of education. And I definitely think this Adoptees On podcast is, and I think some of the social media groups, I love to recommend Anne Heffron's book because I just think it it speaks to our experience. And it seems like there has been a shift where people are wanting to hear from the adoptee.
I guess there comes a point where this becomes so much of my story that it just leaks into every aspect of my life and other relationships because
Right.
adoption comes up all the time. It
Yes.
just does. I just finished another book. Right at the end, there was this whole thing with adoption. I'm like, are you kidding me?
No, I
And
totally agree. So I think also doing our own work is an ongoing process. I think it's a lifelong process. So we're out of the fog, we're doing our own work, and it's kind of like when you get a new car and then you see that car everywhere, like you're driving and you see that same car everywhere. Are you really seeing that car more, or is it just because you just got that car? Do you know what I mean? It might be a really terrible metaphor.
no, you're primed to. Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
What you're saying about the book that you just read. I mean, I love reading. I love reading a whole bunch of books, but I especially like when I'm not reading books for work or books about adoption. I like reading memoirs that chefs have written or cooks like Julia Child or Jacques Pepin. And I just read this memoir. I'm not going to get his last name, he was adopted. And a couple nights ago, watching a movie that wasn't about adoption, but at the very end, it turned into it turned into a movie about adoption. So I get what you're saying, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere.
Those conversation starters are also everywhere.
Right.
And of course, for me, this podcast and is kind of everywhere in my life.
Yes,
So
of
talking
course.
about that, but for my listeners, when you're just having conversations with your friends and family and somebody says something, positive about adoption or someone else's adoption experience, do they have an opportunity to bring something up and start a dialogue? Or is it just one more thing that you're like, oh, that kind of triggered me. I don't want to say anything. And there's just one more positive thing about adoption I don't want to hear right
Right.
now.
Right. I would say it's a case by case, instance by instance, dinner party by dinner party, holiday by holiday scenario. So that there isn't just a one-off answer, but in each instance, is there an opportunity, do you feel like educating someone, or do you intentionally decide you're just not up for it, sitting at the dinner table and something about adoption comes up, maybe you make that intentional decision, like I'm not engaging in, I don't want to engage in this right now.
Or if you're feeling feisty,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe you
Yeah. An
do.
opportunity to educate.
So good. So if you could, would you really, Leslie, would you really go back in the fog?
Absolutely not. I really wouldn't. No. No.
Sometimes I think I would like it for a day, but living and really seeing all of the different aspects of what I've experienced and what my birth mother and my dad and like my adoptive parents have experienced, and generationally, what my kids are now going to experience,
Yeah.
and what my biological grandparents have experienced. I couldn't put that away. I wouldn't I
Right.
wouldn't want to lose that, and I want to live in the truth and the light.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't, in part, I wouldn't have the privilege of doing the work that I do if I went back into the fog. And I just don't think my life experience would feel as kind of rich. So, yeah, I'll stay out of the fog.
Okay, we can be in the sunshine buddies.
Right. It's a deal. It's a deal.
Even though, as we're recording this, you are living in sunshine and I am living in the snow.
I
So
know. I'm sorry. I wish I could send a little your way. It is pretty sunny here.
I would take it. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Thank you.
And
Just thank you for the work that you're doing. I mean, I speak for myself, but I also speak for our community.
thank you. I appreciate that. Where can we connect with you online?
You can connect with me. My website is www.yourmindfulbrain.com. Twitter at Leslie A. Johnson, Leisli A. Johnson, and Instagram, Your Mindful Brain.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
This show is brought to you by my Patreon partners. Patreon is a site that allows creators like me to raise monthly support to help me keep producing this podcast for you. As a special thank you for a monthly pledge, I have a secret Facebook group that is for adoptees only, where we support each other through search and reunion issues, and we get really real about things we are struggling with, like coming out of the fog. Come and join us. Adopteeson.com/partner has all the details. I have a special message from a fellow adoptee to share with you.
Hi, Haley. My name is Mary Jane Huang, and I'm a Taiwanese adoptee from Taipei, Taiwan. I'm also a social worker and a board-certified music therapist. I love your podcast. So many of the stories your guests share and their experiences deeply resonate with me, and I especially love your Healing Through the Expressive Art series. I find healing through music and writing, and I recently had my first book published, a memoir called Beyond Two Worlds, a Taiwanese American adoptee's memoir and search for identity. So I was raised to believe I was one race, but after finding my adoption papers, which my adoptive parents hid, I learned that the story my parents told me was not true, and I had a completely different heritage. So this, of course, set me off on a journey to find answers, and I eventually reunited with my birth family in Taipei in 2012. I also think that underlying the story is a common theme that many adoptees share, and that is of loss. You can purchase the book at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble online, as well as indiebound.org, and at my website, Beyond Two Worlds, that's TWO worlds.com. Thank you so much for letting me share this with your listeners. I look forward to listening to more of your wonderful podcasts.
Thanks, Mary Jane. If you're an adoptee and would like to tell us about your book or blog or whatever you're working on, head over to adopteeson.com/connect and click on the microphone. I love to hear your voices. Today, would you tell one person about the show? It's literally by word of mouth that podcasts are able to grow their audience. If you are able to do that for me, it's just such a huge help to raise up adoptee voices worldwide. I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.
I'm kidding. Don't say that. But you can edit that part out. But